Welcome to Obsession Engineering. It's time to road test the ZX10. After setting the steering damper and the mirrors, I'm out on the road. First impressions, the engine is smooth, the throttle connection is easy, in a way that modern fly-by-wire bikes really struggle to match. It's like there's just a hint of richness to everything that you're really not allowed anymore, and we're worse off for it. The gearing is tall, second gear is all you ever need around town, and realistically, first would actually do pretty much everything. The bike is slim, it's much tighter around the tank than my R1 and probably not far off a ZX6. Other than more legroom, the bike could really pass as a 600. The bars aren't too far away, they're set nice and wide like most newer sports bikes. Everything is easy and familiar, like a normal Japanese bike. It's when the roads open up that I can really start to open the taps a bit. It's not groundbreakingly fast like, say, a V4 Panigale, but it's certainly more than you'd ever need on the road. There's plenty of low and mid-range shove, and once you start to let it breathe, the speed builds faster than Mr. Plod would probably approve. The brakes are okay, but they're not brilliant. They lack a bit of initial bite and there's quite a lot of lever travel before they really do anything. They do definitely slow me down, they're just not very inspiring. The chassis turns easily, it tracks lines nicely, but feels a little bit dull, as if there's a bit of sponge in all the suspension. It's perfectly good, just not giving me as much feedback as I'd like. It's not bad over the bumps either, taking the edge off everything, but maybe taking a bit too much of the edge off everything. Most of the time it's pretty stable too, gently lulling me into a false sense of security. Maybe my memories of lock-to-lock tank slappers along an old airfield whilst running in a friend's race bike, maybe just the old rose-tinted glasses. Or should that be brown-stained boxers? And then the stability goes out the window. I clip a cat's eye slightly leant over at somewhere near a speed limit, and it snaps. Not a lot, just enough to kick it through the bars and remind me that rebels don't all relax into old age. This is most definitely still a ZX10, and it's everything I hoped it would be. But can it be improved? Oh, yes it can. Welcome back to Obsession Engineering, and welcome back to my 2004 ZX10 project. I will admit, it's been a little while since this bike's had any attention. After the sort of initial excitement of getting the project, and then doing the engine service and riding it, I put it in the garage and I got somewhat distracted being busy. So now it's time to do a little bit more on the bike, make it that little bit better. Other than a layer of dust, not much has changed with the ZX10 since last time you saw it, except of course, it now has a standard silencer on it. There are three reasons for this. The first reason is the Termi pipe that was on it wasn't really convinced I actually liked the look of it. It was a bit too big. The second bit, I actually nicked the Termi pipe off it to put on my 08 ZX10 so I could go to Alton Park and go on a track day because it was quieter than the pipe that was on it. And thirdly, I actually quite like the standard pipe. I don't really know why, it's not the prettiest of things, but it is original. Therefore I like it. So what's next for my ZX10? Well, I have some brake pads to go in it, a set of Bitubo piston kits for the forks, an uprated shock piston to go in the shock, a shock spring, some tyres and a chain of sprockets. And then after that there might be a couple of other little details, but we shall come to that later. It's decision time. Where to start? Well, I may as well start at the front. So I'll take the wheel out of it, the brakes off, take the forks out, and then do all of that sort of stuff. So to get the forks out is fairly straightforward. I'm going to take the caliper bolts out and take the calipers off. Then I can undo the pinch bolts, undo the big nut that holds the wheel in, take the front wheel out, then it's mudguard off, and because the top fairing sits fairly low, I can even get in to the bottom yoke clamps and take the bottom yoke bolts out and the top yoke bolts and slide the whole lot straight out of the bike. Getting forks out is pretty simple. As long as the bike's in the air, you just need to take the calipers off, the front wheel out, the front mudguard off, and then undo the yoke clamps and it all just slides out. So I've got the brakes and the front wheel and bits off, and I've undone the bottom yoke clamps. They are a little bit fiddly to get to, but not as fiddly as taking the whole top fairing back off. The last thing I need to do before I undo the top clamp and the handlebar clamp to slide the fork out is check this height of the fork. And as you can see there, we've got about 1mm or so of the gold showing. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to check that with the vernier calipers so that I can put them back in exactly the same place. And next thing you know, the forks are out. Woohoo! So now I've got the forks out the bike, I need some bits to put in them. Conveniently, my fork seals are already leaking and I am putting some new seals in. I was going to change them anyway. So I've got some K-Tech seals which are sort of OEM quality. I've got some K-Tech 9 Newton per millimetre springs, so they're a little bit softer than standard. And then we have the really important bit. Inside my big Bitubo box are some valves. So these pistons, these are the compression side ones, and I will be using a couple of shims from the standard stuff. That sits at the bottom of the cartridge and controls the compression stack. And this is the one that bolts to the damper rod and controls the rebound. So there's sort of non-return bits, and then there's the actual shim stack there that forces the oil through. Now these pistons are sort of a different shape and use different size shims and bits to the standard ones, so they create a different damping characteristic and hopefully create less rebound damping, which is the main problem with the ZX10. So they're good to go. The only slight game is that they are buried deep inside the forks, so we have to take apart quite a lot to go and fit them. So here's my first fork leg, and as you can see the seals were leaking anyway, mostly because it's been sat in the garage and motorbikes don't like to just sit there doing nothing. So conveniently we're going to take them apart anyway. A sensible man, while the forks were in the bike, would have undone the top cap, but I didn't. So what I'm going to do is clamp it nice and sturdily in my soft jaws in my vise, take the preload off it, and then we'll undo that big nut. But what I might do is just apply a little bit of warmth to the tube, just so it expands and lets go of its thread a little easier. So I've just added a little bit of heat to there, not too much, and then hopefully this, there we go, comes undone quite nice and easily. Being fairly gentle so I don't mark any of the top cap. We'll unscrew so that's past the O-ring, and then I'll get the spring compressor involved. Another little trick before I take the spring and bits out of here, because the spring's holding everything tight, it's holding the cartridge in place a little bit. So I can slip my 8mm Allen key up the end of here and just get the start of the tension off the bolt that holds the damper rod in, so that when we've got the spring off, the damper rod can come apart a little bit easier. Right, the next stage is to take the top cap off, and then we need to compress the spring so we can get to the nut that holds the top cap to the damper rod. And for that, we have the spring compressor, but before that, I need to put a spanner on that. So, unwind the top cap, drop that down, and then you can see the holes in this. We're going to put the spring compressor bolts into that, and then as we screw the spring compressor down, it pushes the tube out of the way so we can get to the nuts that hold everything together. You can compress the spring by hand. There is special tools available for doing it, but it is still quite awkward, and a spring compressor is considerably easier. One last thing I'm going to do before I take the top cap off is count how many clicks we have on our rebound adjuster. Now the actual setting is irrelevant because I'm changing the bits it controls inside, but I need to know how many actual clicks there are from sort of end to end. 13 clicks. So that's 13 clicks we have of adjustment on there, and we need to know that for later. So the next stage is to remove the top cap. So I've got a spanner holding the nut on the damper rod, and then I have my big spanner for the fork top. Nice and gently, because the last thing I want to do is mark up my fork top. So I'll put that safely out of the way. So now I can release the compression from the spring and get rid of all the spacers and everything. So I'll take the spacer out. I can take my spring out, but if I do this over the sink, I won't make as much mess. And now I can pour all my old oil away. if you were just changing fork seals or even changing springs, this is as far apart as you'd need to make it. Ignore the O-lins that sat behind it. So we've got the outer tube and the inner of the fork in the bottom, but we need to take the damper rod out of the fork now. Because my damper rod doesn't want to come out, because the bolt in the bottom is a little bit snug, I've put a holding tool in it at the far end, so hopefully that'll keep it in place while I buzz the bolt out. So now I can pull my damper rod out. So now I have the cartridge out of the fork, what I need to do is take it apart. So I need to take that end off so I can get the damper rod out to change the rebound shim stack, and I need to take this end off so I can change the compression valve stack. What I'm going to do is just apply a little bit of heat to sort of loosen off the aluminium outer, and then we'll get a spanner on that end, take that end off, and then I shall get my special tool onto this end and crack this end off. So this is the compression stack that lives at the bottom of the cartridge, and as you can see here there's little passageways and a couple of shim stacks. Now the shim stack at the top here is just a non-return valve, so when the fork is rebounding the other way it pulls oil up through those holes, past the non-return valves and into the cartridge, so the rebound stack can do its job. In compression the oil is forced this way and either goes down a little bypass in the end here, or it goes through the smaller set of ports and has to push against this set of shims down here. And obviously with enough force these shims get pushed ever so slightly out of the way and you get your damping. So if you change the shape of the piston or the shape of the ports or the shims, it alters your damping. Now the bypass, in effect your compression adjuster, what happens is the oil flows down this hole and then it flows through the middle of here into the bolt that holds the cartridge into the fork leg, through the bolt, out of this way and into a drilling in the fork bottom, which is where your compression adjuster is. So if you close the compression adjuster, it basically in effect closes this hole, so more of the oil has to go through the shim stack. You open the hole, more can go through the bypass, you get less damping. Simple really. Right, we have on here the bump stop. Now it doesn't look like much of a bump stop because it's made of aluminium, but what it actually does is that disappears into here, and basically it doesn't leave much of a gap for the oil to escape, so it hydraulics into here, so it is a hydraulic bump stop. So what we're going to do now is just finish unscrewing this, and then we can see what comes out the hole. So we've got in here the rest of the cartridge. That's the top out spring to stop the fork sort of hitting a bump stop at the other end, and a bit of a wiggle to get it out the hole, and that is your rebound stack. So here we go, we've got bump stop, the hole the bump stop goes into, your top out spring, and then down here the important bit. So this down here, if my camera actually wants to focus on it, this is the rebound stack. That's like a piston ring to stop the oil just flowing past it whenever it likes. This side is the little non-return valve again, so that when the fork is in compression the oil just flows straight past this shim stack. Then when we're actually using rebound, the oil will flow through the big port here, through a drilling in the middle of here, and try and push these shims open, which you can't really see very easily, but we can show them a bit more when I've got it all apart. That's all held onto here with a nut. There is a hole up the end of here that goes into out of this hole here, and there's a little needle in there that controls the bypass, a bit like your compression adjuster, but of course it's all the way up here on your fork cap, and there's just a rod that goes down here and pushes the needle into place. So hopefully relatively straightforward. So now let's take it apart and improve it. So here we have the bits of the rebound stack all laid out. These are the bits that make up the non-return valve, just a spring and a plate basically. Now that's the important bit, is the piston. And then you have all these shims, and then obviously depending on how many shims and the sizes of them and all the rest of it, gives you how much flex the shim has when the oil's pushing against them, and thus how much damping you have. But the actual design of the piston is quite critical on this as well, so that's why, instead of just changing some shims, I'm fitting some completely different pistons. So this is the difference between the original standard bits and the uprated Bitubo bits. Now, the actual shape of the piston is quite a lot different. You see, we're getting much flatter faces on the actual sort of damping side where the shims are going to sit, so you get a better shim sealing, and the holes for the sort of non-rebound bit are considerably bigger. So that sits in there, and what you'll notice is these bikes tend to have too much rebound damping. Look at all those shims for the rebound damping, and look what we have now. So this will have a smaller amount but a more controlled rebound, and actually the rebound piston is doing a little bit of compression damping as well. It won't be a massive amount because the ports are big, just a little bit to, you know, help the compression side, so you get your damping a little bit quicker. So everything's a little bit different. We're only using a nut and a washer off the original stuff. I better get putting together. So as you can see, that's the rebound stack all rebuilt. We've got a little bit of sort of compression damping on the rebound stack now. The rebound stack itself is completely different. Everything's torqued up and Loctited in place because we don't want that falling apart. So next, it's back onto the compression side. So here we have all the original bits. This is the bit that bolts into the bottom of the cartridge with the bypass hole in it. Couple of spacers, there's your shims. Then your piston, big holes for the non-return valve, little holes for actually doing the compression work, and that's just your non-return valve bit. Then we have what appears to be not very much. We have a completely different design of piston here with different shapes and different finishes, and yeah, so it does a slightly different job. We don't have that many compression valves because the rebound stack is doing some of the compression as well. We're sharing the load around. We are going to be using the non-return valve bits off that and a couple of washers and bits off the original kit. So I better put that back together. So there is my rebuilt compression stack ready to go back in the cartridge. So all there is to do now is put all the big bits back together. Now that I've got the inner tube and the cartridge and everything rebuilt, the next job is to change the fork seal, which is under here. So I've got a dust seal, which I'm literally going to get a screwdriver behind and just flick out of the way. Then there'll be a circlip, and then I can just prise the oil seal out of the way, slide a new one in. Nice and simple. Have a little bit of rubber against the edge of the fork tube so we don't damage that as I just flick the oil seal out. There we go. That was nice and easy. So I'll just have a little wipe up in there to get rid of some of the dirty old oil, and I'll slip my new seal in. I just like to slide a little bit of oil around the outside of the seal so it slips in nice and easily against the metal. Then you can always use the old seal just as a bit of a driver to push the new seal in. With that seal properly fitted, we'll just slip the circlip back in, making sure it's in the groove all the way around. Then I'll give the dust seal a bit of a wipe and just slip that back in. Now that I'm ready to put my rebuilt inner and my rebuilt outer back together, I'm just going to check around here that there's no big burrs or anything. It's actually got quite a nice sort of taper in, so we're not going to nick the seal on it. If it's quite sharp, as it is on some forks, you can use like a little bit of plastic or something over it just to help it slip over. That moves up and down quite nicely. There is always a tiny bit of play in the bushes, but not bad at all on these, so I'm happy enough with that, and the bushes are in good condition. So now I need to pour some oil in it. So, next step is to fill it with oil and bleed it up. You have to be careful to get all the air out of the cartridge, otherwise you'll have, you know, not as much damping at the top of the stroke. So, plenty of pumping is required. I'm happy that I've got damping all the way through the stroke, which means I've got all the air out of it. So I'm just going to give it a couple of minutes for the air bubbles at the top of the oil to just dissipate out, and then I'll set my air gap. In the instructions for the piston kit, Bitubo give a recommended setting for 110 ml of oil. Now we're using a 5-weight fork oil, which is pretty standard in sort of a race fork. So 110 ml air gap set with the damper completely compressed and the spring and spacer out. There we go. That's all my oil out. air gap set, damper bled up, time to put the spring and the spacer back in. Right, so first the spring goes in. I'm using a 9 Newton per millimetre spring. Then I'm going to put my puller on so that I can pull it up easier to get to the nut when the spacer's on. Spacer on, so now I need to put it back in the spring compressor and squeeze it all together. So now I've got my spring and spacer compressed. Pull my cartridge up so it's just on the top out spring. And now we have the very important part of putting the top cap on, but at the right height. You remember when we started that we counted 13 clicks from fully in to fully out on the top cap, and this is the point where this becomes important, because if I screw this too far down this tube, then it pushes the damping adjuster too far down, and in effect we can't wind enough damping off. Or, if I don't put the fork cap on far enough, we can wind the adjuster all the way in and it won't actually close the damper off. So it is quite an important step. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with my damper all the way out, and I'm going to count in 13 clicks. So 0, 1, 2, 11, 12, 13. Now when I screw this onto here, it should sort of basically put itself in the right place when it's about finger tight. So that's wound on. Now what I can do is I can wind my clickers on and off and see if we've got the right amount of clicks. Yep, 13 clicks. So all I need to do now is wind that nut up to here without moving this, and we have the right amount of clicks. And basically, I just need to take the compression off the spring and we're job sorted. Right, so with the adjusters wound all the way in, you can tell it's fairly firm. With the rebound adjuster wound all the way out, bearing in mind that the rebound adjustment on all of forks like this does actually affect the compression as well. A lot more rebound, but still a reasonable bit of compression. Compression damping all the way out. There we go. Once that's in the bike, we'll do some actual setup on it. Should be considerably better than standard. One last comment regarding fork caps. When you put the cap back in the tube, it doesn't have to be mega tight, because when the fork's clamped in the yoke it'll hold it anyway, and it's actually sealing it on O-ring. So for the sake of the next person who's going to take them apart, don't do them too tight. Now that I have a set of fork legs ready to go back in the floaty motorcycle, I suppose I'm about to go and actually bolt them in, which is pretty much the reverse of taking them out. So I've slid the first fork in, and according to the workshop manual, they should actually be flush with the sort of gold top tube. So it is now flush as per the manual, which is a whole 1mm different to how they were when I took them apart. It may not seem like a lot, but I'm doing it anyway. So the next thing I need to do is torque up these clamps, the underbar clamps and the bottom yoke clamps. They are 20 Newton meters, 30 for the bottom yoke one, and I better really check that in the workshop manual. Right, that is both forks fitted back into the bike. The handlebar clamp torque is 25 Newton meters. So they're in. The next thing to do is to come down this end, put the wheel back in with its new tyre, and then I can clean the brakes and do bits like that and put the mudguard on. I think what I'm going to do tonight is put the front wheel back in and then go home, have some dinner and some lovely apple crumble for pudding with custard. Always with custard. Thanks for watching, and join me again next time when I'll be doing some shocking things to the ZX10.